Hello everyone, and welcome to our first video for Unit 1 in AP European History. The first topic we're going to cover in today's video is the concept of humanism. And really, humanism is only able to happen because Europeans go back and quote-unquote rediscover classic Greek and Roman literature. All of this will really start around the fall of the Byzantine Empire. So remember, the Byzantine Empire, it's really what's connecting Europe to the Middle East in the late 1400s. Right there after the Crusades really weaken it. The Byzantine Empire will fall to the Ottoman Empire, and one of the things that we'll see is that the Byzantine Empire was this great center of learning for a really long time because they used to be part of the Roman Empire. They're what's left of the eastern part of the Roman Empire that continues after Rome falls. So there's a lot of European scholars that actually are working in the Byzantine Empire in the universities that were set up there. And they had a really great university and library system there because they were so stable for so long. And it held a lot of that older learning. So when the Ottomans take over, there's a few different things that happen that really impact all of this. So one, the Ottoman Turks close the Christian universities in the Byzantine Empire. And when those scholars have to suddenly leave, you'll see that they will take back some of the ideas that they had learned from those Byzantine universities with them to Europe. So you'll see, for example, some scholars that were studying ancient Greek things go to Italy, and now they have these ancient Greek texts in Italy that had never been there before. Or you see that there's going to also be a big flourish of these things going on in Spain because there's a large Muslim population living in Spain during this time. We're right there before the Reconquista, where the Muslim people are kicked out of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. So they're actually going to have quite a few Muslim scholars in Spain that are going to be starting to interact with these new powers in the Ottoman Empire and Constantinople. And it's through this that we see a rediscovery of more of these classic Greek and Roman texts that the Byzantines had held. And one thing that we'll see that gets really popular is Plato's work, and specifically the works of Plato that are translated into Latin for the first time, because you now have access to these ancient Greek texts. And that's going to be a big deal. Remember, the well-educated of Europe during this time would be able to read and speak Latin, but this text would have been written in Greek. So now you're going to see more educated people being exposed to Plato's work. Now, this shift to humanism is not something that's going to happen overnight. There's already a system for scholarship in place in Europe during this time, and it's called scholasticism. In the Middle Ages, education was based on this idea of scholasticism, which was an early attempt to blend the Catholic faith with our Christian ideas and Aristotle's teachings of logic and reason. So some ideas for you about Aristotle's teaching are things like using formal logic. So he believes in deductive reasoning methods and to analyze arguments and identify valid conclusions. He sees logic as the foundation of all knowledge and reasoning and emphasizes the importance of clear and accurate thinking. And he also is a really big proponent of this thing called virtue ethics, which is just this idea that happiness is the ultimate goal of human life, and it's achieved through cultivating virtues, which are character traits that enable us to live well. So you have this traditional model of education based on scholasticism, which is really just arguing for a system that blends Catholic faith and Christianity with ideas of reason and logic. So it would make sense that the church is largely unquestioned during this time. And they kind of go hand in hand with the university systems that are popping up around Europe in the 14th century. Then we get this new idea called humanism coming in from relooking at these older Greek and Roman texts. And humanism places an emphasis on the human experience rather than the divine. So you can already see how this might cause tension with the Catholic Church and the current systems of education. Humanism places an emphasis on the individual, which is also something that's pretty different than what was agreed upon before. And it places an emphasis on your own individual ability to achieve truth and wisdom and moral greatness. So, for example, if you're interested in studying Greek and Latin texts, you would be able to teach yourself in a way that betters yourself through those things, and you could raise yourself up, socially. It also operates on this idea of secularism, which is a separation of church and state and government. So again, you can see where the Catholic Church would probably not be big fans of this whole humanist movement. The person that really gets the credit for kind of starting this whole movement is this guy named Petrarch. And he is known as the father of humanism and kind of the Renaissance as well. And he believed that classical philosophy could be a guide to life. He rejects this idea of scholasticism and thought that studying antiquity, which remember, antiquity just means Greek and Roman learning, could civilize mankind, and that you could find all of these moral ways to uplift yourself, and you could create a more well-rounded and educated, civilized society this way. So Petrarch and his followers began studying all these ancient Greek and Roman and Hebrew texts to do this. These new humanists are really kind of the hipster people of their time. They're the ones that think their ideas are so cool and that people doing it in the old ways are really behind and backwards for their forward thinking ways. So humanists start to reject scholasticism because they think the teachings and debates were irrelevant to their modern times and world. There's this famous quote from Petrarch where he talks about, how many hairs there are in the lion's mane was useless, and man should be questioning things like the nature of man and to what end we're born and from whether we pilgrimage. So that first part, the top part about really just like knowing facts and logic, it's not, that's like the Aristotle way. It's the old way. And he's like, no, we should be questioning more about like, what do we know about humans and nature and like how we are the way we are, rather than just knowing facts. And this is going to directly challenge the Catholic Church and other authority figures of this time. Now, Petrarch is not the only person that's really going to be shaking things up during this time. We'll also see people like Lorenzo Valla come into the picture. So Lorenzo Valla is this man who is an expert in Latin and in the Latin language, and he helped create this new study called philology, which is the study and development of languages. And in his particular study of Latin, he went back to look at the origins of words to figure out when they were created, and he was able to discredit some important church doctrine that the church had been using to justify the things that they were doing, because he was able to figure out it was written, like the doctrine was written closer to the 12th century rather than the 4th century, like the church had claimed. And he writes about all of this in this book of discourse on the forgery of the alleged donation of Constantine, where he literally is calling out the church for trying to use Latin as a means to confuse people to get what they want. So again, you can see another example of how these early humanists are really shaking up things and challenging traditional authority. While it may seem like most of these early humanists are really going against the Catholic Church, they are, but that doesn't mean that the humanists are largely unreligious. I mean, you do get some that really separate themselves from the church in general, but we still have plenty of examples, especially later on in this course, of humanists that embrace the church. They just ask for particular reforms to be made. Some of the lasting impacts, though, that will affect the church is that concept of secularism. It doesn't go away, and it actually becomes more prominent throughout this time, and the church will lose some of its influence and power in Europe because of it. And we'll see this again also later on in Unit 1, where these new monarchies that are taking shape, we start to see monarchs, the kings and queens, really trying to separate themselves a little bit from the church because they want to maintain their power, and they see the church as kind of a direct opposition to that power. All of this leads to the development of a new learning category called the humanities. So the humanities was what was studied by humanists, and it's the study of things like Latin grammar, rhetoric, metaphysics, geometry, logic, music, astronomy, and they all kind of stem from those teachings that focus on antiquity, and it's that idea that these are civilizing means of education that will ultimately lead to a more well-rounded and civilized society. So humanities is what the humanists learn. This leads us to the development of this new thing called civic humanism. So while humanism as an idea focuses on the individual and their moral responsibilities, civic humanism is focusing more on how we as people should behave in the public sphere or in our communities. It really starts in the Italian city-states. Remember, Italy is not a unified place at this time. It's not a country in and of itself. You've got all these different little city-states that run independently of each other. And it's there we start to see ideas about what it means to be a good citizen in this way. So there develops things like appropriate behavior for Renaissance nobles and merchants. If you've ever heard of the idea of a Renaissance man or a Renaissance person, that's what this is. It's somebody that's good at a lot of different things. So the ideal Renaissance person would be somebody that could sing, they could paint, they can write, and they can be athletic. They're well educated, well rounded as a whole. So we see our focus on the best members of society are those that are well rounded and well educated. There'll be a lot of people that comment on like what it means to be a civic humanist, but the most famous person that we'll talk about, and his name will pop up throughout this course quite a bit, is Niccolo Machiavelli. So he's a civic humanist who wrote this book called The Prince that shared his ideas on human nature. And spoiler, he had a pretty pessimistic view of humans. He didn't think that people could control their behaviors or could really govern themselves. And so he advocated for a strong leader. And not just that, he said that those leaders could be gained through conflict, which basically goes against a lot of ideas taught previously about monarchs and governing. So traditional monarchs were supposed to be pretty like benevolent, abide by the Ten Commandment type of things, and that's how you would judge if they were a good ruler or not. But this guy's now saying that it's better to be feared than loved, and leaders can gain control from conflict, and that the strongest leader is the one that should be there, and that they should really have a heavy hand with the people. So he's going to be a proponent of things like absolute monarchs, which is another theme that'll be prevalent throughout this course. Of course, you get all these ideas about education and people bettering themselves in the Renaissance period, but this is really only applying to elite men. Overall, women's rights do not really improve during the Renaissance, and some people actually argue that their rights were lower during this time. They're seen as not only subordinate to men, they may be able to own property, but they can't sell it without their permission of their husbands. They're usually paid less than half the rate as men doing the exact same jobs, and they're often seen as a burden to their families because when they got married, they had to have a dowry or a payment that was going to be paid to the husband's family, basically to take the women off the hands of their own families. These were seen as really big expenses for a lot of families. So you'll see that some really wealthy families do educate their girls, but basically they're just going to do things like study letters and orations and some literature, but they're not going to be studying things like mathematics or reading about politics or anything that would actually give them more agency. Oh, but wait, there's an invention alert. Big things are happening during this time period, and the printing press is finally invented. Or I guess I should say, it finally made its way over from China. Because we know, because we all took world history, that the Chinese were the first to develop the printing press about 400 years before it finally makes its way to Europe. And then a man named Johann Gutenberg in 1454 is going to master the typeset printing press, where he can move around the letters and create mass-produced book pages. The first book ever printed is going to be the Bible, of course, for this time, and it's called the Gutenberg Bible. And because of this, we see crazy effects. Ideas are able to spread at rates they've never been able to before, and it's a really big reason that things like the Renaissance and later the Protestant Reformation are going to be able to occur at the successful rates that they do. So just to give you an example here about the mass quantity of text that will spread. Here in 1500, about 50 years after the printing press is invented, there are around 35,000 books that are published. So that's like first-time authorship being made, not like copies of books printed. Then 100 years later, in 1600, you can see that there are close to 150 to 200,000 books that are published. So people have ideas, they just needed the means to be able to produce them. Now, you might think because of this that literacy rates would rise rapidly, but actually literacy rates are going to increase pretty slowly. So think about the first books are created, they're still pretty much going to be written in Latin, which is going to be something that the common people can't read. And even if you have money, you probably can't read Latin. So eventually, books will start to be written in the common vernacular of that region, the common language. But even still, literacy rates will rise pretty slowly, mostly because there's no form of public education during this time. So it's still really only the wealthy that are able to learn and read, and the poor people don't. So even though the first printed book is the Bible, we actually will start to see the printing press really challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. It leads to a lot of questions of traditional practices, especially when things get written in common vernacular. It also makes it a lot more challenging to control what's being written. So before this, when things were handwritten, you wouldn't have very many copies of non-biblical texts, and it was really easy for the church to censor the message getting around. But now people can mass produce books, and the church is going to find it a lot harder to stop people from sharing ideas that they don't like. All right, that's it for Humanism and the Printing Press. Thanks for watching.